Well, today we're going to begin our lecture time talking about the Crusades. And it's easy to recognize the importance of this topic to our own history that's going on right now. Obviously, it has very close connections to the world situation. Because of continued conflict between the West and the East, between the world and the radical Muslims that are continuing to fight not only in the Middle East, but actually around the world. And for them, the Crusades are only yesterday. Whereas for us, they typically carry little meaning on our policies. But nonetheless, we need to be aware of what took place back in those medieval centuries so that we can understand a bit of our own history and the history of our relationships. So let's look at the Crusades and define them, set them in their historical context, and see what we can learn. The medieval Crusades can be described as a holy war. The idea of holy war actually originated with Islam and their idea of jihad, and yet the West kind of took on this concept as well. It was a war called by the Pope and carried on by Western kings against the enemies of the Muslims in the East. And actually, the Crusades also refer to the wars waged by the Pope against heretics and even political enemies in the West. Although for the most part today we'll be talking about the Crusades in the East. There were 8 major Crusades from 1095 through 1291, so about 200 years. But we don't need to think of the Crusades as being individual, well-demarked events. Instead, the Crusades were a continual wave of an impulse, but they did have high points that can be defined as by their numerical order. So there are some high points in the Crusades, but generally the crusading was a constant impulse for these 200 years. Now, what were the motivations? Well, on the one hand, pilgrimages to the Holy Land increased after the year 1000. For one thing, there was high expectation that at the end of the millennium, Christ would return. You can see how this would be understood reading the book of Revelation, that the millennium, the 1,000 years, was a significant time, and so there's an expectation for Christ to return, and when he did not, then they felt that it was necessary for them to make these pilgrimages to the Holy Land, either in order to bring on Christ's return or to be prepared for Christ's return. So, after the year 1000, we have increased pilgrimages. Also, the idea of pilgrimages had continued to increase as means of acquiring merit. And this idea had been nurtured ever since the early church and during the period of martyrdom, when Christians felt that to conduct pilgrimages to a place of martyrdom would bring about merit. So we have increases in pilgrimages, but Muslims, on the other hand, increased the hardships on pilgrims, and they destroyed shrines in Jerusalem and Israel. So there was a great deal of concern in the West about the situation of the Holy Land. So there was a desire to reclaim the Holy Land. Well, we talked the other day about the advance of Islam following Muhammad's death, that in that next 100 years, that Islam had proceeded north through the Holy Land, east through Persia, west all the way across North Africa, and even into Spain, only to be stopped by who? Charles Martel, 732 at the Battle of Tours. All right, but the Muslims continued to advance, and by the 10th century, the 11th century, they had taken what we call Turkey, and were just on the verge of capturing Constantinople. So they had taken 2/3 of what had traditionally been considered Christendom. All right, so after these military advances, the Eastern Empire was weak, and the West felt vulnerable to the Muslim invasion, not only from, they had stopped it in the West, now they were concerned about the East. So there is a sense in which the Crusades were a defensive military operation. Okay? I think we need to understand that there is a sense in which the Muslims were threatening the West. Usually today, the Crusades are presented as Western aggression against the Muslims. Okay? And although I don't want to be put in a position to defend the Crusaders, nonetheless, we need to recognize that all of this was initiated by the Muslim militaristic advance. Okay? So, it is really irresponsible to say that the Islamic terrorists can be excused by what the Crusaders did hundreds of years ago. Okay? But we hear this from many today. Okay? But we need to realize that without excusing the Crusaders, we must understand that there were faults on both sides. All right? In the West, many knights and peasants were eager for wealth and adventure. Remember, the feudal system kept everybody pretty much tied to their current status. But the Crusades offered adventure and opportunity for wealth and advancement. And so they were eager to join in on these new adventures. Well, and then ultimately we have strong encouragement from Pope Urban II. He had received a request from help from the East, and he hoped that by assisting the East in this hour of great need, that it might bring about a reunion of the East and West. Remember, this is 1095. It's only been 40 years since we've had the Great Schism, so there was a hope for a reunion. And then, in order to seal the deal, in order to make this a very promising venture for those involved, the Pope promised indulgences for full remission of sins for those who died in the Crusades. What does this mean? This means that if a crusader takes on this cause, and remember the word crusade comes from the Latin word crux, for cross. If a crusader takes up the cross and makes this effort to regain the Holy Land, if that person dies, then that person is promised full indulgence for his sins. No time in purgatory, but immediate access to heaven. Okay. Now, this is really the beginning of the abuse of the indulgence system in the Catholic Church. Later on, those who could not participate in a crusade could provide the finances for someone to go on a crusade in his place. And then, for the person financing the crusade, full indulgence for sins was promised. So, it was just the payment of funds for a crusader. Then, much later, the Pope decided that, well, let's just take out the middleman and just say that if a person pays funds to the Pope, then the Pope will offer a full indulgence for sins. Okay? Now, how is it that the Pope has this kind of authority? Remember that the Bishop of Rome, later the Pope of Rome, claimed to have descendants from Simon Peter, who had received the promise of Jesus Christ, that he was the rock upon which the church was built. And he received the keys of the kingdom, that he had the power to loose or to bind on earth. Okay? And so the Pope believed he had the keys of the kingdom. And also, part of this doctrine was the idea that martyrs and saints died with more merit than they needed to achieve salvation. And so their extra merit went into a treasury. And this treasury then of merit was provided what the Pope needed to use his keys on in order to provide merit to those to whom he wished it. Okay, so this is the beginning of indulgences, but you need to understand that how it developed over the centuries until we get to the place where it's abused mightily in the 1500s when Martin Luther takes offense. And so we see the beginning of the Reformation. Okay? Any questions about indulgences? Okay, this is where it begins. So, the Eastern Emperor asked for help from Pope Urban II because the Turks were threatening the Byzantine Empire. Urban saw the chance to reunite Christendom, and so he called the Council of Clermont in 1095. All right? He promised full remission of penalties for anyone going to fight, full remission of sins with eternal reward to those dying in the cause, and he promised the protection of Peter, Paul, and the church for estates, so that any landowners who went to the Crusades were promised by the Pope that they would return to find their lands intact. Now we're going to see that in the case of the Third Crusade, that the church was not able to protect Richard III from the plundering of Philip II, his ally in the Crusade. But we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So the council cried, "Deus vult," God wills it. And so we have the beginning of the crusading impulse in 1095. All right, there actually were two armies that advanced from west to east, and one of them was the People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit. He led a mob heading to Jerusalem. So these were the poor, the outcast, those seeking some fame and glory and money, and this mob left. Now they had poor provisions, and so they pillaged the countryside along the way. They came across some Jewish communities, and they said, well, if we're going to purge the Holy Land of the infidel, we might as well start right now with the Jews here in Europe. And so they slaughtered Jews along the way. Many of them died from plague and famine. Tens of thousands died along the way. So the People's Crusade was was an ill-fated venture. But the formal crusade arrived safely at Constantinople, and they allied with the Byzantine army. They captured Nicaea easily, and then they went on to Antioch. And there they captured Antioch after a long siege. However, once they were inside the fortress, they heard the story that a Muslim army was advancing, a very large Muslim army, and they feared they would not have the strength to withstand their siege. One of the clergy, Peter Bartholomew, claimed that St. Andrew had revealed to him the site of the Holy Lance. And when the Holy Lance was uncovered, it would make them invincible. Now, what is the Holy Lance?
Is that the one that pierced Jesus' side?
Yes, it's the spear of destiny, the spear with which the Roman soldier pierced the side of Jesus so that water and blood came out. There was a legend that rose up around this spear. In fact, the soldier was given a name, Longinus. And the story was that Longinus became a Christian. He became known as Saint Longinus. And the spear showed up in several different places, but had stories built up around its magical power. All right. Many of Europe's most important political and military leaders had owned it. Constantine, Alaric the Visigoth, Charles Martel, Charlemagne, and Frederick of Barbarossa. Later on, centuries later, in the 20th century, this spear played an important role. There was a broken spear that was on display in the Hofburg Museum in Vienna, Austria, and it captured the attention of Adolf Hitler, who was familiar of the legend of the Holy Lance, and he was fascinated with it. So as soon as Germany annexed Austria, Hitler ordered the SS to seize the spear and to bring it to Nuremberg, and there it was stored in St. Catherine's Church. 1944, it was actually placed in a specially constructed vault beneath the church. But when Nuremberg was captured by the Allies, the vault was discovered. The spear was confiscated on the afternoon of April 30th, 1945. Less than 2 hours later, Hitler committed suicide, adding to the mystique of this spear. So, Hitler perished after the relic was taken from him, and today the Holy Lance has been returned to the Hofburg Museum in Vienna. Interestingly, as I said, there are several different spears that purport to be this spear of destiny, and there's another location of the spear in the Vatican, in St. Peter's Basilica. There's the altar and the canopy is surrounded on four sides by different statues, and one of them is a statue of Saint Longinus holding in the statue. He's holding a spear, and supposedly in the base of the statue is a fragment of this spear. So again, the spear is in many places, but the idea is that there's great supernatural power attached to it. All right, so back to Antioch, back to Peter Bartholomew. They're digging, seeking to find this great artifact that will guarantee their invincibility. And when they don't find it, Peter Bartholomew looks around, he grabs a spear, he jumps down into the trench, and then he says, "Look, here's the Holy Lance. And so it was uncovered, and the Crusaders rallied against the larger Muslim army. Okay. June 12th, 1099, the Crusaders see Jerusalem for the first time. And out of nowhere comes a hermit who prophesies, if you attack tomorrow, the Lord will deliver it to you. Well, there was no way they were prepared to attack the next day. They had too few ladders. They could not scale the walls. But based on this hermit's proclamation, they made the attempt, and they were defeated, and so they were forced to withdraw. During the long siege of Jerusalem, the Muslims are supplied with food and water, but the Crusaders had very little water. In fact, the Muslims had poisoned the water wells outside the Jerusalem walls. So, the Crusaders needed siege equipment, and they had to transport water and wood from long distances until a supply ship arrived in Jaffa. Well, the Crusaders were doing what the Westerners had always done. They feuded, they deserted, they suffered. Many of them died. And so the cause did not look good until a priest reported a vision of Adamar, who was one of the bishops who had participated in the Crusades but had died early. And Adamar appeared and said, "Purge your sins, march barefoot around Jerusalem, fast, and then attack on the 9th day." And so the Crusaders marched barefoot. They ended up on the Mount of Olives. Feuding princes embraced each other, and so once again they were united. They built the siege equipment. They prepared their weapons. The battle began on July 13th. 2 days later, weary Crusaders considered withdrawal, but then they saw on the top of the Mount of Olives a knight waving his shield. They took this as a sign, and so they attacked again. This time, burning arrows caught some wood in the walls and caught the walls on fire. At that point, they were able to push a siege tower up close and create a bridge to the wall so the Crusaders could enter the city and open the gates. The governor surrendered. Jerusalem was sacked and Muslims were slaughtered. And the description of the sacking of Jerusalem is brutal. And this is one of the stories that fuels the fire against Westerners because of the cruelty of the slaughter after they had finally breached Jerusalem. Godfrey of Bouillon was named protector of the Holy Sepulchre. He would not take the title King of Jerusalem, but his brother later would do so. So the First Crusade ended in success in that it achieved their goal of regaining Jerusalem and much of the Holy Land. Okay, this of course, this illustration is an exaggeration. They did not find the cross, but they did find a number of relics that they sent back to Europe. As Martin Luther said later, they brought back enough nails from the cross to shoe every horse in Saxony. Okay, all right. So obviously they were just kind of grasping at anything that would be considered a relic from the occasion of Jesus' life and his passion. Now, following the First Crusade, they set up the Latin Kingdom, where the Knights had different territories. And then the Knights did as they had done in the West. They began to fight each other. And they would even create alliances with Muslims in order to fight other Westerners. So the alliance of the Westerners in the East was weakened. So it should not surprise anyone that the Muslims were able to regather their forces and begin to take back some of the property. And so they recaptured Edessa in 1144. And so the call came from the west to send out another crusade. Bernard of Clairvaux, the great preacher among the Cistercians, preached for a crusade. In 1147, German and French armies marched to the Holy Land, but they had no success. They were defeated at Edessa, at Laodicea, and at Damascus. The crusade ended in disgrace, and the soldiers returned. Bernard, being a clever preacher, was able to turn this upside down and create a good preaching point. That is, he said that the failure of the Second Crusade was a result of the sinfulness of the people. They must repent. And so that's how the Second Crusade ended. So then, in between the Second Crusade and the Third Crusade, we have a very fateful year, 1187, when a general arose among the Muslims named Saladin, and he was able to unite the Muslims into a great army, and they captured Jerusalem. All right, we just mentioned the movie Kingdom of Heaven, and in spite of its historical weaknesses, yet the overall story of the capture of Jerusalem is told in this movie. And we see that the Crusaders were lured into the desert before the horns of Hattin, which I have seen, and foolishly they left the security of Jerusalem and went on the attack against the Muslims, and they did not carry with them sufficient water. And so there in the desert, they were weakened by dehydration and easily defeated by Saladin. And so Jerusalem was captured. This is what brought about the call for the Third Crusade. But what we can learn from watching the movie Kingdom of Heaven, what we can learn by realizing that this war of 1187 was that, again, that the Crusades were not just events separated into neat segments. It was an impulse that continued, that was constant. And so following the defeat at the Horns of Hattin, following the capture of Jerusalem, we have the call for the crusade, the Third Crusade, which is the crusade of the three kings, Frederick I, Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip II, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England. Richard I, Richard the Lionheart of England. These were the three kings that headed to the east. Frederick had a great victory, defeated the Muslims at Iconium, and then as his troops were crossing the river, he became impatient and he decided he was going to swim the river with his armor on. Okay? Not a great move. Okay? What happened to him? He sunk. He drowned. He drowned in the river. And so that was the end of the German participation in the crusade. Philip participated in the victorious siege of Acre, and then he departed for France. And there he hoped to take Normandy back from England while Richard continued in the crusade. Remember what I said about the promise of Peter, Paul, and the church to guard the lands? All right, did not work. Philip left Richard there. Richard and his English army alone was not able to win back Jerusalem, but he did negotiate a treaty with Saladin that would allow Christian pilgrimages. So the Third Crusade had minimal success. Now, in 1192, Richard sailed for England, but was shipwrecked. Then in Austria, he was kidnapped by Duke Leopold. The ransom was paid, and he returned to England, and there he settled affairs with John, his brother John, who had tried to take the kingdom away from him. Then he began a war against Philip II, and he died in battle. A stray arrow hit him in the neck and killed him. Now, you may have seen that event in the Russell Crowe version of Robin Hood. And of course, you know this story of Richard's kidnapping and the ransom from movies such as The Adventures of Robin Hood and Ivanhoe. These are classic movies. These are before my time, okay? That's how old they are, but they're worth watching. And they do have in the background the aftermath of the Third Crusade. All right, the Fourth Crusade. If you think it's been bad so far, it just gets worse. The Fourth Crusade was instigated by Innocent III. He sent this crusade against Egypt. However, the Crusaders, in seeking transport to Egypt, they made a deal with the with a fleet that, instead of taking them to Egypt, took them to Constantinople, because they wanted the Crusaders to get involved in a dispute over the emperor. And so, in order to secure a deal to get transport to Egypt, they had to go to Constantinople first. Well, once they were there, they decided, well, why should we bother going to Egypt or the Holy Land? Because look around. There's a lot of gold and money and women here. And so why don't we just rape and pillage Constantinople? And that's exactly what they did. So we have the Crusaders fighting against Eastern Christians and destroying the city. And in doing so, they established the Latin kingdom in the east. So Innocent III was furious that these Crusaders had gone against his will, until he was reminded that, oh, this united the East and the West. Okay? And so he thought, well, maybe the end justifies the means. Well, it didn't last long. In 1261, the Byzantines recovered their territory, but the schism between the East and West was deeper than ever before. But in the meantime, the Constantinople was so weakened that 200 years later, they were ripe for destruction by the Muslims. All right, along the way, we have a couple of children's crusades, and these are sad stories. In 1212, a young French teenager named Stephen rallied 7,000 French children, aged 12 to 18, with the dream that the poor and the pure could accomplish what armed men could not, the recapture of Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre. And so they advanced, they marched to the Mediterranean Sea, expecting that God would part the sea so they could walk to the Holy Land. Well, they got to the coast, and that did not happen. And so they were trapped there. Most of them died of starvation and exposure. Some ships came along, offered to take them to the Holy Land. They got on the ships, and they were taken and sold into slavery. Okay, so
They weren't very bright, were they?
well,
I can swim with armor on.
yeah. As far as the children goes, they seem to be superstitious. They seem to be caught up into the superstitions of the age. There's a German boy named Nicholas who led a similar but also unsuccessful venture. So these children's crusades. Now, the 7th and 8th Crusades are later in the 13th century. Both of them were led by Louis IX, King of France. Today he's known as St. Louis. All right, are we familiar with St. Louis? Well, yes. If you've been to the French Quarter, you've seen the St. Louis Cathedral. If you've been inside, you've seen the beautiful stained glass windows that depict his life, his work in the Holy Land, where he participated in a miracle of healing a man from the plague. And so he was declared a saint. He's the only monarch ever to be declared a saint. And however, he was unsuccessful in both his crusades. Oh, I should mention that also in the cathedral, the apse has a beautiful mural of Louis setting out on the crusade. Then comes 1291, and the Crusader city of Acre fell. Now, after Jerusalem was taken by Saladin in 1187, the Crusaders never recaptured Jerusalem, and so their capital city became Acre, coastal city up on the northern edge of Israel, and it was a powerful city and a wealthy city. Everything that came into Israel from the west, everything that came back out to the west from Israel went through Acre, and Acre became a wealthy city. That's where the headquarters were for the Crusaders, for the Archbishop of Jerusalem, for the Knights Templar. But in 1291, the Muslims attacked from the sea. They leveled it, and rubble piled in over the top, and they let it remain dormant for decades. Eventually, they rebuilt the city on top of the rubble with the Crusader Fortress buried beneath. So recently, they've actually excavated the fort, and you can now travel through it. It's very interesting. I'll show you pictures in just a minute. But in 1291, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land ended, and the Crusaders never again had any land in the Holy Land. They resettled in Cyprus and attempted invasions. None of them were successful, and so the Crusader impulse turned then against enemies in Europe, and they would attack the heretics and even political enemies of the Pope. And the Pope would promise indulgences again to any crusades against heretics or his enemies. But the Crusades in the Holy Lands essentially ended in 1291. So, what were the results of the Crusades? The power and wealth of the papacy increased. There was an increased interest in relics because the Crusaders would bring back articles from the Holy Land that were believed to have spiritual power. Again, the crusading zeal turned toward fighting heresy. The Knights Hospitaller were formed in 1092. They provided hospitality and care for the sick among pilgrims and crusaders in the Holy Land. And then the Knights Templar provided protection to pilgrims and crusaders. They fought in the Crusades. They were considered some of the greatest fighters in the Crusades. Unfortunately, their reputation was damaged considerably because they were among the leaders who were defeated at the Horns of Hattin. And then later, they established this practice of banking in the West and the East that enabled the Crusaders to carry their letters of credit from the West to the East and maintain their wealth. So they really were among the first to begin banking houses, and they built great fleets and great wealth which disappeared after Philip II, again, the same Philip II that attacked the holdings of Richard, attacked the holdings of the Knights Templar. We talked about that last week when he sent his secret messages all throughout France, and the Templars were arrested on Friday, October 13th, 1307. This Friday the 13th. Just to give you some details of the way the Templars were treated, there were 54 Templars that were burned at the stake in Paris. In 1312, the Templars were disbanded. In 1314, the last Templar, the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake. And of course, as I mentioned, the Freemasons today claim their origin out of the Knights Templar. And we see them in a number of films, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, National Treasure, Da Vinci Code, and even the Kingdom of Heaven. So the Knights Templar, quite legendary. All right, mistrust and enmity developed between the East and the West, Muslim and Christian, and this enmity continues to this day. There was an increased contact there's an increased contact between the West and the Byzantine East and Islamic civilization. And so there's a sense in which the West benefited greatly from scholarship and knowledge. There was a recovery of the philosopher Aristotle. Until now, there had been very little of Aristotle that was known in the West. And the Greek philosopher that influenced the West the most was Plato, because of Augustine's influence from Neoplatonism. But Aristotle began to have great influence in the West, and scholarship rose in the West. We're going to talk about this when we talk about scholasticism in the next couple of weeks. We had the rise of city-states in Italy. Trade networks began to form so that there were other ways of obtaining wealth and power through banking and trade, so that land was not the only way of creating status in the West. Okay? Any questions about the Crusades, the results of the Crusades? Well, I have an interesting story to tell you about how the Lily of Israel became the fleur-de-lis. This is a picture of a shekel in Israel today. And you can see the Lily of Israel, the Lily of the Valley that is inscribed on the modern coin. Well, here's a picture of an ancient coin with the three petaled flower from the 11th century. Well, the Crusaders liked this image so much they carried it back with them to France, where it became known as the fleur-de-lis, and then the fleur-de-lis became the symbol of France. It now adorns the French flag. French explorers then brought it with them to America, where they settled Louisiana and New Orleans. And the New Orleans Saints now bear the sign of the fleur-de-lis, which actually comes from Israel during the crusading era. Isn't that a fascinating bit of trivia? You just never know what you're going to learn from church history. Now, I have had the privilege and blessing of traveling to Israel a few times, and I have been able to tour several Crusader castle sites that have been uncovered by archaeologists. And it is at the Crusader castles that church history intersects the Holy Land. Well, here's a picture of Apollonia, which is a fortress that was built along the overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. In 1101, Apollonia was captured by Baldwin I of Jerusalem. He was the brother of Godfrey of Bouillon. He was considered the first king of Jerusalem. In 1187, Apollonia was captured by the Muslims, same time as the Battle of Hattin. But then a few years later, it was taken back by Richard I the Lionheart. And then it was maintained by the Crusaders through 1261, when it was ruled by the Knights Hospitaller. And then in 1265, it was destroyed and razed by the Mamluks, one of the Muslim tribes. So here's just some pictures of an arch overlooking the Mediterranean. Here is a capital from one of the pillars. You can see the Crusader cross. Here's another beautiful view of the Mediterranean Sea, and another view. This is Tel Aviv in the distance. Well, here's a Crusader with his princess at what was a kiln, or where they baked pottery. So there we are at Apollonia. This is November of 2013. Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea by the sea. This was a site built by Herod the Great as a summer palace, but later on it was overtaken by the Crusaders and then the Muslims. And this is the fortress entrance to the Crusader site. Here's a moat that's built around that fortress. It's a dry moat. I hear that often they would put wild animals in there to further deter invaders, but nonetheless, you can see how any invaders that would get into the moat would be easily picked off from the walls. This is a high arched area in the gate. This is Nimrods Fortress, which actually was a Muslim fortress built along the pattern of Crusader fortress. These fortresses were always either on the seashore or up high, and this is overlooking the Hula Valley in the Golan Heights, built by Saladin's nephew for protection against the Sixth Crusade. After 1291, when Acre fell, it fell into disuse. Originally called the Castle of the Large Cliff, it was renamed Nimrod's Fortress by later Druze inhabitants, and Druze still live in that area. The Druze, by the way, are a kind of unusual sect. They have connections to the Muslims, but also to the Jews, and they actually consider themselves citizens of Israel, and they will fight with Israel in the war, in any war that Israel undertakes. The very unusual thing about this Druze sect is their idea that the Messiah will be born of a man. And so the men wear these very baggy pants that actually connect at the knees in case a man is walking along and suddenly gives birth to the Messiah will be caught in his baggy pants.
Are you being serious?
I am being very serious. So, yeah, I probably should have included a picture here of Druze and their pants, their baggy pants.
Where did that thought come from?
I can't answer that, but just the idea of there being a miraculous birth of the Messiah. Okay? Even far more miraculous than our story. I mean, I guess they're looking for something that was even more spectacular than the virgin conception. Okay? All right. Moving along, here's a picture of, here's another picture of some of the ruins. It's really an extensive property with a great view. And here's a symbol of the Mamluk lion and some engravings. All right, Belvoir is the most intact of all of the Crusader castles that have been excavated. And it's, you can see the stonework is basalt or volcanic. You see this dark rock, you know that it is basalt. Belvoir means beautiful view. It's also known as the Star of the Jordan. The Knights Hospitaller constructed a concentric castle. It's actually a fort within a fort. Protected Crusader lands from the east. In 1188, it resisted the initial attack during the Battle of Hattin, but eventually fell. It's the only fully excavated Crusader castle in Israel. And here's another picture opposite of the one you just saw with the dry moat, arches with my guide and friend Dr. Parker showing us through. These are this is an arquebus. And this is a little slit in the wall for the archers so they could see through and shoot, but could not be shot in return. So they were offensive and defensive. Again, just some beautiful panoramic views from Belvoir. All right, here's some columns, and this is one of our trustees, and a suit of armor. Montfort, we didn't tour it, we just saw it from across the way. Montfort was owned by the Teutonic Knights, which is one other military order that came out of Germany, the Teutonic Knights, but a beautiful view of what remains of its castle. Well, here are some Teuton Knights. Craig Garrett, Stan Watts, Dr. Parker, and me. And so visiting that site, we had fun that day. Well, this is, of all the places I've been to in Israel, this is probably the highlight. Dr. Parker took me and a few others on a side trip. We actually left the group and went to Acre and went to this underground fortress. This is the dining hall. You can see the huge columns there. Here is in the corner, there is a fleur-de-lis embossed on the corner. So you can see that the fleur-de-lis was a common ornament back in those days. Here's Dr. Parker with cannons. You need to really watch when you get Dr. Parker's, get firearms in Jim's hands, so you are in danger. Then, of course, here's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was built in the time of the Crusades. And it's a beautiful sight. How many of y'all have been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Okay. You go in, and of course, you're just kind of overwhelmed by the religiosity of the place. And the first time I was there, when I saw the mosaics and the candelabras, and you smell the incense and the crowds of people, and we were walking up to this site, and I turned to Jim and I said, "Jim, where am I? What is this place? What's going on?" And Jim explained that most scholars believed, and he believed as well, that this is the place where Jesus died, where Jesus was crucified. And so I'm approaching this very ornate crucifix with the candelabra, but then I noticed that along the side there was plexiglass floor, and beneath that you could actually see rock formations. And I realized, oh, this this whole complex, this whole Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is built on top of a mountain. It's built on top of Mount Calvary. And you can't tell because of the massive size of the structure. It's in the middle of Jerusalem. But then when you can see the rock, you get the idea, oh, this is the place where Jesus was crucified. And right in front of the crucifix, there is a table, and beneath it, there is this silver socket where you can kneel down and place your hands inside the socket and feel the rock. So it's quite an impressive structure. And once I understood what was going on, it really became a moving sight to be in. Here is the place that's known as the empty tomb, and there's nothing that remains of the original here, just a marble chapel that's been built. But behind it, there are some caves. They're called the Caves of Joseph of Arimathea. Jim took me back there, and he said that he found them one day because he was looking for a bathroom, okay? And so he found them kind of off to one side. But when you go in there, you kind of get more of an idea of what the caves really looked like, where Jesus was buried. Well, this is another site that is further away from the center of Jerusalem. And it's called Gordon's Calvary because it was discovered by a British officer who was part of the occupying force in Israel back in the 19th century. And he looked and he saw this place and he thought it looked like a skull with the eyes and the mouth and the nose. And he thought of what he had read about Golgotha, the place of the skull. And so he gave birth to the idea that this might be the place where Jesus was crucified. And indeed, next to it, they excavated what they call the Garden Tomb. And this place, now not the place of the skull is public property. In fact, the Muslims have built a bus station, a mosque, and they're putting a cemetery on the top of it that is going to crush it down so that the skull no longer is recognizable. But Muslims do that where they can. Wherever it is possible, they build their mosques next to those sites that Christians consider holy. And so they've done this with the place of the skull. But they can't do it here because this is owned by a group of British Protestants. And so this place is really quaint. It's got gardens in it. And they've discovered a 1st century tomb that honestly no one believes this even is possibly the tomb where Jesus was buried, but it does give us a better idea of what that place looked like. And so this is a very very quaint place, and this is possibly certainly is a place where a body lay. And then on the inside of the door it says, "He is not here, for he is risen." And I've been inside, and I can attest that that tomb is empty. And they have a stone rolled away. And anyway, it's just an interesting sight there in Jerusalem. So I just kind of wanted to show you some of the Crusader sites and then show you Jerusalem.